creating this group. I owe a big word of thanks to Dr. Raj for introducing me to you. And then, ever since then, it has been an endless journey, or let's say pilgrimage, of learning, discovering, fulfillment. I do not want to speak much more than this about you in your presence. That may not be in good taste. So let me come back to what motivated me to disturb you this time again. I worked for nearly 30 years in the Department of Humanities at IIT Madras. And after going there, I discovered that Sarkar Commission, which recommended the creation of Indian Institutes of Technology, had not envisaged a Department of English or a Department of Economics. It envisaged a thought of a Department of Humanities, much like it was in leading universities in North America or in some places in Europe. So, in humanities department, we are a middle-sized department. We are about clearly 40 people, larger than computer science, larger than aerospace or, or ocean engineering, but smaller than physics, mechanical, electrical, and chemistry. So we're a middle-sized department, and I found that there was nothing like English or economics or history. It was designed to be a department without inner walls. Actually, even the department didn't have a wall. Our immediate neighbors were people from physics and people from mathematics. So after I went there as an assistant professor, and I retired as professor after, within few years, they promoted me this, that as you go. And I discovered that a view of your own subject from another compartment, another platform, reveals much more to you than you were even aware of earlier. So I soon had interaction with people in computer science. And though I have a PhD I have been a student of language sciences. I specialize in the organization of and production of sounds, speech sounds, which is called phonetics and phonology. But I found we had a lot to learn from physics. I found that we had a lot to learn from computer science. And they were also kind enough, good enough. Some colleagues who were old enough to be my teachers invited me to talk to them and sat in my lectures. I particularly remember some people from physics and some others from computer science, eminent people by their work, by their education, but they were humble enough to sit. So in my turn, I also started calling them to my classes, my courses. I remember a professor of electrical engineering who taught a part of my course on Indian classics and cultural values. He had the entire Valmiki Ramayana by heart. He would never, only Rajji could claim that, as far as I know, in this group. And Professor Sankaran he was in the power systems, but he would very gladly take 3 weeks, 9 hours on Valmiki Ramayana without consulting any text, without consulting authorities. Similarly, we had people from computer science, we had somebody from physics who I had to once teach a lesson which described the history of atomic bombs. So I was just curious. I wanted to know what was difficult. And Professor Balkrishna described it to me without any algorithms, without any derivations, at the end of which I asked him, if it is so easy, why don't we do it every Diwali? And I remember his answer. He said, Shri, in that case, you and I won't be here. So, later I myself got into some serious interdisciplinary researches, like, working with doctors at the mental hospital. What are the symptoms of schizophrenia? They also show in language. Or in cognition, so dyslexia, dysgraphia. And finally, I found myself working with people in history, looking at the history of foreigners and foreign languages. I had the curiosity, what language did Alexander ask Porus in? How Porus should be treated? Or what was the language of conversation between Vasco da Gama and the Zamorin of Calicut? Or between Captain Hawkins and Jahangir, Emperor Jahangir? Both of them drank a lot and took. Jahangir was an opium addict. What language was there? And how did they speak? It was fascinating, to say the least. And I don't think I have been able to answer all the questions, but at least I knew which way the answers would lie. As recently as a couple of years ago, my colleagues here asked me if I could put together a course in English classics, something that everyone should know. The occasion was a senior professor at IIT Madras did not know whether Shakespeare was a novelist or a playwright or a poet or what. And I don't think we should hold him guilty because he was a professor of an engineering department. So he really was not expected to know. But then the ignorance on this side was more abysmal. A good number of people in humanity would not know whether Copernicus came before Galileo, whether Kepler came before Newton, or what language did Newton write in, etc., etc. Even research scholars, even students of physics, I used to teach a compulsory course at IIT, which had about 500 plus students, mostly research scholars, a component of research methodology, which had senior research scholars. And I would routinely ask them this question, put up photographs and say, tell me who is Newton, who is Galileo, who is Kepler. Nobody, a lecture theater full of 500 people would get up and say, this is this, that is that. Now, because you know these facts don't make you a good physicist. A good physicist is one who is good at mathematics and who has done the toil. But these things, social context, historical context, enrich you, as we discovered. So in this case also, I found that in the 2 years of pondering, talking to a lot of people, I found that English literature was what it was today, global presence. And it happened well within 500 years, notably under 400 years, ever since Queen Elizabeth came to the throne of England. England was a third-rate country, or even fourth, did not count more than Afghanistan counts today. It was a nuisance in Europe. That's about all. But here came a girl at the age of 16 who not only changed England, who changed the world. The way businesses happened, the way navies and armies were organized, the way arts and literature was done. She discovered native talent and she had the courage, because her own survival was at stake. She had the courage to declare a sea pirate as the admiral of her navy, who took on who took on the Spanish Armada. Spain had 100 plus boats to attack the British Isles. These poor people had fewer than 20. But under Francis Drake, under Walter Raleigh, they were known sea pirates. They were not only able to destroy naval armada of Spain, they became a power to reckon with. And only then, it happened in 1580s, and then only they had the courage and the confidence to come to India without the permission of the Pope. Famously, Captain Hawkins told the general, Portuguese general asked Captain Hawkins if he had Pope's permission. Captain Hawkins said, no, I have my Queen's permission, which is good enough. And they were able to get in. That's another tangent. I don't want to go that way. So here we started looking around and we found that 4 other people at least had influenced English literature as much as or more than even Shakespeare and Chaucer, Newton being the first. Before Newton, there was hardly any prose literature in English. Francis Bacon had some random essays, Ben Jonson had some random essays, but nothing worth the name. Not that Newton always wrote in English, but Newton did something which brought Europe's attention and that way the world's attention to the United Kingdom. Here was once and for the first time, and perhaps for the last, that Arunji will say, if Newton was the first of the tradition or last of the tradition. But here was someone you could not ignore. Though his main work happened in Latin, because Latin was the language of science, just as English is the language of science today. So main work happened in Latin, but he wrote a lot of other things, including poems, letters, notes, covering letters, minor pieces, which were all in English, all in prose. And England in Newton's time was a rising country. Queen Elizabeth had been dead, Parliament had come to power, Parliament itself had internal differences, so the king was invited. Restoration happened in 1660, and King Charles II, who came back on invitation from France, also brought in a Royal Academy, Royal Society. Royal Society did science, did letters, did a whole lot of other things. And coincidentally, history has a peculiar way of working more strangely than perhaps fiction would. 1660, Royal Society is created, and 1665, actually 64, Newton obtains his BA from Trinity in Cambridge. 1666, he obtains MA from Cambridge. And 67, he becomes a senior fellow at the age of 25 or 26. He became a senior fellow at Cambridge Trinity College. The years in between, Arunji will tell you, the story of the tree, where that tree was located, etc., etc. But all of these things started prose literature in English. There were no journal. By 1700, 1709 to be precise, 1705, prose periodicals like Tatler, Spectator began, Edition and Steel began, which needed articles, stories, poems, prose pieces, and customers had arisen. A community becomes highly literary only if other things are also there. So here was a flourishing business due to East India Company. Of course, it was at the cost of India. Of course, it was exploitation. Of course, there was slave trade. All sorts of tortures which England should apologize for today, as Shashi Tharoor famously said. But remember, here was a rising country and rising in all departments, not just in commerce. So there were people who would buy those journals. A Spectator's first copy itself sold 550, now, which was a big number, as Gibbon's book had sold in 19th century. So we found Newton had tremendous impact on English literature, prose. There was nothing called prose literature before Newton in English. Dryden, for the first time, wrote a long essay of dramatic poesy. Some of his plays came in prose. Preludes started coming in prose, so much so that 18th century became, in English literature, the century of prose pieces. I've been a history of the English language and literature. I've been at the history of England, its politics and sociology. And if I had time, or if someday we'd like to talk about that, I can give you lots of examples of how this led to the serial production of stories, then came novels, then came English literature as we know it today, more because of its prose literature than because of its poems and plays. Coming back to the topic, for English classics, I needed somebody, some scholar in physics, who, like Stephen Hawking, could tell us what Newton had done. For people like me, ignorant of nearly everything that you would need a lifetime to know. Did not know beyond a few laws of motion. I knew by heart third law of motion of Newton because I had used it to explain the backflow of the Ganga in Bengal, Bihar, and the devastation of Bengal, Bihar, and the ruin of Ganga itself. Newton's third law explains it much better than anything else. I was vaguely aware of some of these things, but I didn't even surely know what it was. So I started looking around on my campus, IIT Madras. A lot of very senior professors, learned ones, but everyone told me, Shri, I won't be able to. Please pardon me. Talk to X. So I talked to some people. I spoke to some people in North America. Again, they all X referred to Y referred to Z referred to A. They were all busy. They were all high-profile scholars. None of them had time. In India itself, I spoke to people in ISER, Pune, ISER, here and there. In other institutes of eminence, I need not tell them because they all had their own preoccupation. I need not present it as if nobody knew. I was puzzled one evening, and then suddenly it occurred to me, why don't I speak to Arunji? And then Arunji responded as he always does, very enthusiastically, and he told me to share with him my questions and whatever else I had. So I shared with him my questions, whatever else I had. By then, I had collected links to two important things. Two English translations of Principia, one from the 18th century, 19th century, the other more recent. And you see how, in India, we are intellectually starved. At least with those that I checked, nobody had seen these translations. Most recent translation is by, I think, Chandrasekhar of the Nobel Prize fame. But even the older ones, which are easier ones, nobody had seen. Not that they needed to, perhaps they didn't, but even out of curiosity. So much so that IIT Madras Library had no copy. But then the current head of the Department of Physics there, a young person, a young gentleman, very enthusiastic, and one guy, one young boy on the library counter, one 10 o'clock late in the evening or later, told me, sir, you just be here half an hour, have a look at this magazine I give you, and I will give you the link to the soft copy. And true to his word, gave me the link to the soft copy. True to his word, the professor of physics, the current head of the Department of Physics, IIT Madras, got me full text, including biography of Newton, and I can't tell you how rewarding it has been to me. Then I was apprehensive whether Arunji will agree, whether Arunji will change his mind. But God bless Arunji, may live for at least 1,000 years as our sages used to. He readily agreed and he went on from there, discovering, telling, sharing with me. He sent me Chandrasekhar's lectures on Shakespeare, Beethoven, and Newton. I also got some other things from Keynes's notes, Keynes's lecture, Newton Memorial Lecture. Keynes himself was an economist, but a very good mathematician, I am told, almost at the level. And Keynes had said, no less a person than Keynes, about Newton, here was an exceptional mind. And why? Because he could do 40, 50 pages of derivation in his mind, keep them, and when he found time, he would scribble them. That is why, since his early childhood, he was a loner. And the story that is there of the sitting under the tree did not happen at Cambridge. His biography claims it happened at Woolsthorpe in the backyard of his house. Arunji, I have taken much longer than I should have. I feel guilty. Astushji did not ask me to stop. But I would like you to take 2, 3 sessions and reveal to us the mystery of Newton as perhaps Sri Krishna did of the universe, of the cosmos, to lesser souls like Arjuna. Here I am, never got 30 on 100 in mathematics and want to understand Newton. Thank you very much for your generosity, Arunji. Please, Astoshji, take over.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for such a beautiful introduction. to a much awaited talk. So, without much ado, I'll request everyone, as we have been doing in the past, to kindly mute yourselves and kindly also switch off your cameras, except the main speaker, Arun sir. So, Arun sir, over to you. The stage is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Saab. Since it's a long session, I'll just come to the point immediately. I have divided the session in two parts, time and audience, and God willing, we shall go to the second part. The first part obviously is Newton standing tall at the beginning of a tradition, not one tradition, many traditions. We have heard about his chemistry, his maths, physics, some work in chemistry. But today, of course, as the your wish is my command, sir. Today we are going to talk primarily on his contributions to the growth of English as a language. If time permits, we shall go to the second part, which many of us have found very intriguing, that for 50 years of his life, till his death in 1727, Newton has worked on both his Principia also and on alchemy, going back to the architecture of ancient times, finding out the calculations, the diagrams, the measurements, and both of them are going together. That part we are not very sure about how far is it true. But yes, as Dr. Chaudhary said, in 1933 or so, John Keynes bought Newton's private notes, which were hidden from the world for about 300 years. He bought it in an auction. The notes were in codes. So it took him around 6 years to decipher those codes. And after the codes came out, the world saw a different Newton, a person totally different than what the world knew. A person, according to some, was a dangerous heretic. Some called him a pseudoscientist. Some called him flirting with science and religion and scriptures, and a lot more. So my second session will be about that, on which he has really spent 50 years and totally privately alone. But that would be if God, as I said, time and the audience permits. I come back to the first session now. I have already shared with you a brief on Newton's early life with most of you. Acha, before I proceed further, sir, in the audience, we have two very young kids. There is one Ayush Prasad. He is most probably 11 to 12 years of age or less. And then there is Madhusmita, whom I met in Bhubaneswar. She is around maybe 13 or 14 years of age. So I'm really happy for Ayush and Madhusmita. And of course, Ayush's uncle, Sunil, is there. So I wanted to tell everybody that we have a very, very young audience here also. Okay. So, but maybe not with them, but I have shared with almost everybody the brief history of Newton, especially of his formative years. And also that how during the plague, when Cambridge was closed and he went to his county, he had done kind of work which he himself he calls that time Annus Mirabilis, the years of wonders. Of course, when he came back to Cambridge around 6-7 years, he decided to leave science and mathematics completely because of the criticism he got, mostly unfair, from his fellow scientists. And it is during that time he read Hebrew, Latin, scriptures, and a number of things. And most probably to me, it is during that time that he developed insight not only in these languages, but English also. So here is the session. A brief history will not hurt anybody. The conquest of England by Normans in 1066 had shifted the linguistic landscape of England. French became the language of the aristocracy, and of course, Latin still was the language of the church. This gentleman, whom some of you might not have heard or known about, very few of them might not have heard, so I'm showing, he is called Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer, who many call the father of English literature. Of course, he did borrow a lot from French, but he mainly wrote in a dialect which is called East Midland dialect. This eventually became the basis for London English. 250 years later, Shakespeare also wrote not exactly the same way, but he wrote in what is called early modern English. So from Chaucer Britain, to Shakespeare, we have come from East Midland dialect to early modern English. Newton also wrote in the same language. But unlike Shakespeare, Newton started using a language which was more harmonized and precise compared to the flexible poetic prose style of his predecessors and his contemporaries. Sir Chaudhary talked about Royal Society. The Royal Society calls Newton's prose plain and naked. He favored natural over rhetorical and ornamental, like Chaucer or Shakespeare did. He found a language which was totally devoid of flowery and metaphorical prose. This made both during his time and later the philosophical and scientific inquiry inviting rather than austere and forbidding. This transition was a crucial step in the development of what later was called the Enlightenment prose, or also the prose of reason. Newton, I will come to the slide. Probably some of you know that Newton's first book, the Principia, was in Latin. But the second book, Optics, which he again did in 2 or 3 parts, they were written in English. And before you admire Newton, let us look at this line from Optics. Newton says or writes, "My design in this book is not to explain the properties of light by hypothesis, but to propose and prove them by reason and experiments." I showed this slide because it is he probably after whom this prose of reason and the Enlightenment prose starts. Okay. In book 3 of Principia, Newton includes a section called titled Rules of the Study of Natural Philosophy. One of the rules is no more causes of things should be admitted than both which are true and sufficient. I'll repeat, he writes, no more causes of things should be admitted than those which are both true and sufficient. The other rules also are equally concise, logical directives that define this era of rational approach, also called the prose of reason. Actually, in his general scholium, his famous phrase, which is on the screen, which many of you might have seen, hypothesis non fingo. This he wrote in Principia, which means I feign no hypothesis. Sometime later, when I come to his Optics, I will talk also about the transition of a man who feigns no hypothesis. He also did go on to provoke people to think on possibilities which may need some hypothesis, but about that I shall come later on. But in Optics, Newton uses what is also called a chain of invincible reasoning. This is the previous one. So I'll come to that. I'm speaking without, I did not need the slide. So whereas in Principia, he talks about no more causes of things should be admitted rather than with both true and sufficient. In Optics, he also uses the word called chain of invincible reasoning. And this he had done to describe white light, how it is composed of different colors. Many of us know that he did an experiment through a prism, but before he did that, it was a mind experiment, and where he had used what he calls chain of invincible reasoning. This is, to my mind, a very mind-boggling kind of a thing. I mean, you design an experiment in the mind, you imagine, then you observe, and then you combine the two to come to a conclusion. Actually, even in his non-scientific works, about which I shall talk in the second part of the session, Newton applied the same rigorous language, focusing, instead of the direct relationship between observation, linking what was known previously by the ancient people observation, and then from there he finds his, I would not say conclusions, but he does get some idea into God and spirituality. About that, I shall not talk right now. I shall talk later on. But what I am saying that even his drafts of the writing, which is called non-scientific, these drafts also are exceptionally organized. He treated biblical history like a mathematical problem. He corroborates different testimonies. He confirms whether his mathematical equations about the measurements of Solomon temple are correct or not correct. He corroborates, and he uses a style which is mirrored in scientific deductions, which were used later, not as much as his time, later by philosophers and writers. But from totally being deductive during his time of writing the Principia, when he comes to the stage of writing Optics, he also follows inductive path. He also follows inductive path, which is also called Baconian path. Professor Chaudhary had talked about Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon obviously also is known as a person who is using induction and inductive philosophy. But so I would not say Newton exactly took from Bacon, but most of his inductive writings are called now Baconian. His influence on people like Locke and Voltaire, not to speak about the people who came later, was so profound that a person of the stature of John Locke talks of Newton as that is John Locke, I am an under laborer clearing the paths of master builders like Newton. Voltaire viewed Newton's empirical method as a machine de jure against the French dogmatism and religious superstitions. Voltaire was very, very, I mean, it was very, very almost instrumental in bringing Newton to Europe. And the book that he uses is The Optics. Hegel, however, is not a very big fan of Newton. He criticized Newton for weaponizing reason. Interesting phrase, isn't it? He says that Newton's worldview almost is fanatic to the extent of being reasonable. He writes, if it requires a great clock maker, which he called deism, rather than a meddling deity, then Newton might as well talk about the deity and not the clock maker. But at the same time, Newton is talking about the clock maker that I will come later on, who was behind everything which was happening in the world, namely light, namely gravity. But yes, to Hegel, he was more of a meddling with deity type, not essentially as much as a great clockmaker. One of the it's there previous, the previous slide. The previous, sorry, vernacular. Yes. Due to my very limited sense of understanding, after reading lots of articles written on optics, actually, honestly speaking, I do not know many people, probably Chaudhary sir will tell me, I did not find many articles or books on Newton's contribution to English as a language. Some parts are in his biography. So one had to really consult, in my case, me, the professors of English, the people who are excellent in linguistics, using some libraries. So they are purely my version, but I am very sure I may be wrong. According to me, the four important contributions of Newton's English are vernacular, sensory, evidentiary, and what I already said, chain of invincible reasoning. So I'll take them maybe one by one. When he talks about vernacular, that is not very difficult to understand. The word sensory hit me like a bolt. Let me be very honest about it. According to Newton, he used the word sensorium to describe space. Sensorium is the part of the brain where senses transmit perceptions from the mind. So, writing about sensorium, that he is using that sense of sensorium very often in his writings. So I'm calling the word sensory, which I have borrowed from a professor of English who was writing, who had written an article on him. Newton suggested that space is like a God's sensory organ, which allows God to perceive things immediately. Before I come to evidentiary and chain, just it comes to my mind that Newton, I also respect Newton because I found that he is one man who has introduced some terms in English and popularized some which earlier were there, but not much in use. The people who have done physics, very elementary physics, they will know the words which I am going to write now, they were either introduced by Newton or popularized. Words like inertia, tends to, gyration, spectrum, refraction, reflection, inflections. Some of these words were, I would say, created by Newton. I mean, if not created, I can say introduced. Similarly, he uses a word in his Principia, persevere, because he does not like the word continuous.
Yeah.
The difference between the two words, persevere and continuous, is not to be underestimated. Okay. Coming back to Newton, other than the fluidity and accessibility, he really made English accessible to people in England after he wrote Optics. But I'm going to one step further. The other hallmark of Newton's prose is its being evidentiary. The reliance on direct observation. This established English as a language for scientific discourse. The empirical, the methodical approach also had a huge influence on the philosophical and theological works of his time and later. About chain of invincible reasoning, I have mentioned, I will come to it later on. Now, I am just showing you some slides. They actually are the literary works after Newton, which were totally, I mean, I couldn't say totally, but more or less they were influenced by Newton. So the first one I collected was the Tatler and the Spectacle. They were highly influential periodicals founded by Richard Steele and Joseph Addison. The essay formats which these people insisted by the people who wrote the articles that they should be blended with social commentary, morality, and the literary prose taken from Newton. This process which these literary magazines started, they exhibit some of the Newtonian clarity found in the Optics, reason and good sense. I'm quoting the word reason from and good sense directly from Optics. Physico-theological poetry. This special genre of poetry, which was used in 18th century, this used Newtonian physics to demonstrate the existence of God and his attributes. This poetry had used precise and quantitative vocabulary to describe nature and the universe. This influenced many to move away from metaphysical jargons. Next. Philosophical and scientific writings. Thinkers like Benjamin Franklin, Anton Lavoisier, and James Black, they adopted the experimental methods exemplified by Newton and the other mathematical reasonings of Principia. They started a standard, theirs was a standard approach for the scientific investigation, solidifying a clear model for scientific writing. The deceptively plain and casual first-person narratives followed by the later-day writers is obvious. I'm using a line from next slide. No, go back to the previous one. Okay, I shall read the slides. For that, okay. Next. I will read the line which I have taken from from the optics. And the line I have taken to demonstrate what I call deceptively plain and casual, but still precise. Newton writes in a letter to his fellow physicists, this, and in order thereto, having darkened my chamber and made a small hole in my window shuts, to let a convenient quantity of sun's light, I placed my prisme, he calls it prisme. I placed my prisme at the entrance that it might be thereby refracted to the opposite wall. Now, this is poetic, no less poetic than the words of Shakespeare. But at the same time, it may look very simple, which I call deceptive, or may look like casual. But this is what made Newton find white light is composed of 7 colors. Actually, there are several more paragraphs written in such beautiful poetic English, which may look plain, but they are not plain. Next poetic. I'm talking. Just give me a second. Influence on literary imagination and form. Yes, the previous. Okay. Now I come back. I continue the Newton's effect on various other forms. So this is his influence on the literary forms. Now, mind you, I'm talking about not literature. I'm talking about the literary forms, which is a huge thing, which Newton, if not started, definitely affected. I will talk about the queries of his optics later on in detail. Right now, I'm using queries. In queries, he introduced a rhetorical form, which is called enlightenment metaphor. His literal exploration of light provided the defining metaphor for the age of enlightenment. So that literary form during the age of enlightenment was actually influenced by the optics. This influenced poets and philosophers. They used light and clarity as literary symbols for reason and dispelling it. I have also made a brief, instead of going in detail, maybe for time or maybe we can take a different session. So here I say that again, I found 3 very important aspects of Newton's English. It is evocative and it has speculative language. The queries at the end of the book, they are just amazing. And of course, he inspired a new wave of English literature during the age of enlightenment. Now here I'll come to the age of enlightenment, which I called Baconian sometime back. I must add here that Bacon, actually I already said that Newton was primarily deductive in the earlier stages. But when people call his style Baconian, Baconian was inductive, but so was Newton. And especially in optics, his inductive approach also becomes very, very obvious. In the Baconian tradition, queries were intended to stimulate further inquiry. Okay. So, this is an interesting development in Newton's. This I found very interesting. Personally, I was very intrigued in the beginning, and I find this very interesting how Newton is growing. Remember his earlier line, I frame no hypothesis. That was the time of Principia. And when he writes optics during his queries, he talks about speculations. So this journey of Newton from I frame no hypothesis to the queries which are full of speculations. So again, I'm showing you a passage. Yes. Look at this passage. Hence, therefore, it comes to pass that whiteness is the usual color of light, or light is a confused aggregate of rays endued with all sorts of colors, as they are promiscuously darted from the various parts of luminous bodies. I mean, this is not poetry, what it is, but I have taken this particular passage for 2 different reasons. Look at the word hence, therefore. I did not find But of course, my knowledge and reading is very, very limited. Professor Chaudhary and others will say, but I did not find this kind of a use, hence, therefore, anywhere during Newtonian's era of English. Then, please look at the word endued. Please look at the word endued. Aggregate of rays endued with all sorts of colors. John Milton had used the word endued in his poem, Tyrants in Titan Lands. He writes, tyrants in Titan lands endued with combustible matter. Endued is a past tense of endue. And recently I found the word used endued by Aurobindo sir, Shri Aurobindo. In one of his poems, he wrote, sorry, I got confused. Actually, Sir Aurobindo wrote in his poems, tyrants in the Titan lands endued with combustible matter. I seek forgiveness. John Milton had used the word endued to describe inherent qualities of clothing or of a soul or a character. His line is, with such celestial light endued. I have taken this from Paradise Lost, book 11. Of course, during the course of time, the language evolved much further in the last 100 years also, and it's still evolving. I mean, look at T.S. Eliot, who writes, like the evening layout against the sky, like a patient etherized on a tip. I mean, this is the modern English. But it all started from Newton. This is what I wanted to say. And especially, I was very, very happy when I found the word endued used by Newton, later used by Shri Aurobindo also. Next. Just a moment. Now I come to Professor Chaudhary's suggestion to me. If I can look to Newton and his works, and if I consider them classic, or if I can recommend them as classic. So the question is, before I go to that, so I told Professor Chaudhary when I went through the latest translations of his Latin work, which I found in a 2023 edition published by the Newton Project. I went through Sir Chaudhary's link also, which he had sent to me. And after 2 weeks or so, if he remembers, I had told him that, sir, the problem with Principia is, no wonder language is just amazing, rational, all the beauties I discussed about Newton are there. But it is so mathematical in nature, mostly using geometrics and figures and diagrams, that for a common person, it may be difficult. Of course, all classics are difficult. Is it easy to understand Shakespeare? No. Chaucer? No. Milton? No. But with Principia, I talked to some of my students who are abroad, who passed from IITs, some of the professors who are teaching English. Sorry, I'm talking about IITians. They said that they also had not read Principia. And when I sent them the Principia link to them, they said, boss, it is beyond us. So if they are finding it difficult, I do not know if this should be considered as a recommendation for the book, as a book for the students of literature. But optics. So my question is, should optics be considered a classic? Well, what is a classic? I mean, we all know that classic novel is about beauty and truth, having survived the passage of time. But to my mind, it also must inspire and provoke not only the readers, but also the writers and the artists of its time and future. So 3 words I thought should describe a classic: should be able to provoke and inspire. Now, if I look at some of the classics which inspired people, Freud totally changed his approach to psychology to a different, what is called the psychology based on Oedipus complex. He had got the idea from Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, right? Actually, Newton himself gets lots of inspiration from Pythagorean philosophy, which actually emphasizes the transmutation of substances and the soul, and that he uses, if I get time, in alchemy. Then again in alchemy, when Newton is trying to produce the philosopher's stone, the inspiration he gets from Ovid's poem Metamorphosis. So not only Newton, I would talk about there are many other authors who have been inspired by Newton, and they, I mean the list is quite long. So that way, should this be considered as classic? I would say definitely. I do not know about that. I will come later on. But after I have already discussed to some extent some points, some duties of optics with regards to the language, I would say this. I would say that it would be for scholars to decide actually, or to take a call on optics or other books by Newton, about which I shall talk later on, whether they should be considered classics or not. Should they be taught in schools and colleges? So that I'm not competent to answer that. It is their call. But to my mind, as I say, speaking for myself, I would definitely recommend at least some selected passages from optics or other books for the academic curriculum. I mean, these are the finest examples how English should be written. They can also tell the students how the language has evolved, and more importantly, or equally important to me, this will tell them how poetic prose can be written rationally. So I come to the almost the summary of this session, although so much work has been done that I can take 2 or 3 sessions. But in this case, go to the next slide. I will summarize this session, and I will say that to my mind, my limited amount of reading and the perception I had after reading the books I mentioned right now, lots of periodicals and articles written by Newton, written on Newton, I thought that the 11 reasons why Newton can be said to be one of the biggest contributors to evolution of modern English are shift to the plain style, experimental narrative, inductive structure, modernizing English as a social scientific language, accessibility. Accessibility was very, very important. Technical vocabulary, influence on literary imagination and form, rhetorical and structural rigor, unified and harmonious narrative of nature, methodical authority and rhetoric, and last but not the least, the rhetoric, the queries. Not this time, but I would love to take a particular session on the. So before I come to that, in the second version of optics, Newton has made some changes. At the end of the second version of optics, he adds what he calls queries. In queries, what does he do? He's telling the readers of the future generations to think about certain ideas. And some students, I mean, who have done some science, elementary science also, they would understand what kind of future vision Newton had when I talk about this. Newton talks in the queries whether can you combine matter and spirit? Are the two same? Do they affect one another? One of the queries. One of the other queries is it possible that light would affect matter? Light would change the position of the matter? Are you getting photons? Impact of photons on a pendulum when pendulum moves? Newton talked about it in 1700. And then he goes on to say, can you think whether matter will affect light? Actually, to my mind, in my mind, what I had about the query is what is called the final word. This last paragraph, the 31st query of Newton, I would love to take a special session only on this, the final, what he calls the final passage. I'm not talking about the last word which when Newton said, I was like a child picking up stones, etc. I'm talking about the final word. In this, the next one, next, no, the previous one, previous one, no. Okay, forget it. Go to the next two. Just that's all. I would read this. Just one passage of this the final word I'm talking about. I would love to take a session, or if not, at least 10 to write an article on that. The one small passage of the final word reads, in this book, I have begun the analysis of what remains to be discovered about light and its effect upon nature. He talks about, if natural philosophy in all its parts, by pursuing this method, shall at length be perfected, the bounds of moral philosophy will also be enlarged. For so far as we can know by natural philosophy, what is the first cause, and the power it has over us, and what benefits we receive from him. So far our duties towards him, as well as towards one another, this will appear to us by the light of nature, about which he does not talk in optics. He asks people to explore. Probably if he was alive, he would have done that. The last line is, and no doubt, if the worship of false gods had not blinded the heathen, their moral philosophy would have gone farther than our four cardinal virtues. And instead of teaching the transmigration of souls and to worship the sun and the moon and the dead heroes, they would have taught us to worship our true author and benefactor. So definitely this is worth taking a next session. Now, so far as I am concerned, I have come to the end of this session, and there are so many poems and things written about Newton that, I mean, you can find on Google, they are endless. But I am choosing this particular one from William Blake. Before I end my session, this part, the 4 lines of William Blake are, reason and Newton, they are quite two things, for so the swallow and the sparrow sings. Reason says miracle, Newton says doubt. I repeat, reason says miracle, Newton says doubt. Aye, that's the way to make all nature out. So that was Newton for you, gentlemen. The first part is over. Before I come to the second part, of course, I would need your permission if you permit and if time permits. But I think this is time for Ashutosh to take over and maybe ask the audience if they have some comments to make, some questions to ask, whatever. Ashutosh, all yours.
Thank you, sir. As expected, you mesmerized all of us, and the lines which are right now on the slide definitely were the icing on the cake. So I will now keep the house open for any comments, questions, or queries by the audience, and also a general kind of query. Should we continue with the next session today itself, or should we have it on another day if everyone has time? So both these things.
Yes, we can go ahead with the second part of the session this evening. It's not late. It's only 8 p.m.
Okay.
So will not take more than 30 minutes. Sir.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'll also check with Shri, sir. Sir, I know that you are quite constrained in terms of time. So will it be possible for you to be here for the next 30 minutes or so?
If Arunji is not free next week and if that is the only option, then I will be.
Okay.
Given the choice, I will say, let's take it on. Let's take it next Saturday.
Sir, just before we leave, I mean, you leave. I know you are extremely occupied with lots of you are working on lots of fronts, too many rods in fire.
No,
but sir,
would you have
a word or two for what I just spoke? Any
come again?
Based on what the presentation I had on language part, the first part. Yeah, or would you like to send me a personal note?
For me, if this answers my need, that is done, and then now comes the extra. So, if you are not free, or if next Saturday is not free, number 2, if all others present here want it today, then I am also for today. Otherwise, since I have to vote now, so sorry, Rajji, I if possible, let's do it in continuation, though, not bringing anything else. Otherwise, let's continue, please.
No,
Nothing very
no, sir.
pressing.
My one problem is I have got some very young children, one from Hyderabad,
Oh.
one from and one boy from Nepal. So they might not be available next session. So if the audience permits, let me finish this. We definitely
Yes,
have the recording. This can be shared with all. I'm very, very
let's do
sorry, sir,
that.
because I did not know the audience, this kind of an audience will come.
No, no,
So
we are just now warmed up, actually. This, this was introduction. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, in a
So, Arun
surgeon's
sir,
language, in the
yeah.
surgeon's language, you have
yeah.
just now washed your hand. What is that? Scrub your hand. The operation will begin
Okay,
now.
starting the session with a video. I mean, with a very small
Ar-
20 seconds video, just to
Arun sir,
enlighten the mood, just to enlighten the mood.
Arun sir, just one thing, just 30 seconds from me. Uh, Sir, I had something coming up in my mind, and please pardon me if I'm wrong. So one word that came to my mind was, and I learnt in calculus, probably in first year, ISC first year or something like, infinitesimal, which I never heard anywhere. Do you think that this is something which can be attributed to Newton, which we learnt in
Both,
calculus?
both. Actually, I have my presentation today had at least 6 more pages. I wish I could do that. But since you reminded me, Newton also uses 2 words which were not even in the Oxford Latin dictionary at that time, and one was gyrere. There were different words linked to to gyration, etc. But he really coined that word. And second was infinitesimal. If I have 5 minutes time, I can explain to you in 5 minutes where did he get the idea from. So should I?
Please, please.
Yeah.
Okay. Basically, when Newton was working on that apple falling, which Professor Chaudhary was right, it is not the
Can't hear
for
you, sir.
after. Are you there? Am I there?
Yeah, I
Can you
can hear
hear
you
me?
now. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
we
can hear
can
you
hear
now.
you.
Okay. Okay. So what comes to Newton's mind when the apple is falling? It is falling under acceleration due to gravity. In simple English, its velocity is changing at every point of time. And if its velocity is changing at every point of time, so if I want to take one moment, the word velocity itself becomes a ridiculous idea. Newton says that. And if I don't consider velocity, if velocity becomes ridiculous, then momentum, kinetic energy, entire physics becomes ridiculous. So what is it he's worried about? He's worried about 2 things. Body that is falling, its velocity is changing at every instant of time. So if I want to talk about velocity, I will have to fix an instant. Otherwise, next instant, it will be different. So for that, there was a word called instantaneous velocity. Velocity at an instant. Now, the problem is at one instant of a time, the body is always only at one position, isn't it? Take a freeze shot of a cycle. At one shot, body is only at one point. So at one point, body cannot be in 2 positions. And if the body cannot be in 2 positions, there cannot be a change in position. So there is the word velocity is meaningless. So he said, I cannot use the word instantaneous velocity because at one instant, the word velocity itself is meaningless. So from there, he gets the idea. What does he do? He says, let at one instant be body at one point and next instant at another point. Now, there will be a difference of position and there also will be a difference of time. So if I divide the difference of position by difference of time, what do I get? Velocity. But the problem here is this change in position will be a finite number. Change in time will be a finite number. If I divide the two, you get a constant finite number. Contradiction. That constant number, which is velocity, is actually not constant, it's changing. So there, that instantaneous spark of creativity bol lo, jo bol do, it comes to his mind. He says instantaneous velocity is ridiculous constant and I need velocity. And the moment I change the time, there is a time gap and there is a position gap. If I divide the two, that constant is also ridiculous because it is no more constant during the displacements. So what he does, I divide the two, but I make the time gap very, very small so that the displacement also becomes very, very small. So during that small time, I can assume that change is there. It is so infinitely small, I can consider that change also zero. More importantly, time gap also not zero, nearing to zero. So from there he gets the idea of, I take the gap infinitely small and the time gap infinitely small. So when the ratio, although it is not zero,
There's some connectivity
but
issue.
he also,
Yeah. Yeah, we
yeah,
missed
okay.
out for
Am I
few
there?
seconds. Yeah, we missed
Okay,
you
okay.
for few seconds.
So,
Yeah.
so that's also okay. I'll repeat that. So from there, Ashutosh and people who have done mathematics, from there he gets the idea of tends to, the time difference tends to be zero, which is not equal to zero. So he converted equal to tends to. X is equal to 2 is not same as x tends to 2. So he got the idea of tends to, and he got the idea of limit. If there is a small difference in position divided by small difference in time, if I put a limitation on this expression, and what should be that limitation? The time should be so small, the time gap should tend to zero. From there he got the phrase, I think, infinitely small or infinite small. Have I been able to do some justice to it, Ashutosh?
Perfect, sir. Thank you. Back to you.
Ashutosh
But
ji, I will add a footnote to what Arun ji has said. You know, the most authentic history, there are lots of books on the history of English language. Lots, not one or two, many. Nearly all of them are unanimous in the opinion that if you take away words of Greek and Latin origin, you can do no science in English.
Mhm.
Whether Newton brought them all, I cannot answer with just now. Maybe, you know, as Arunji has said, we should wait. Please,
Thank you,
Arunji,
sir.
go on.
Back to you, Arun, sir.
okay. No, in this, normally it's just one line. Every word or every sentence I spoke previously, and every word, every sentence I'll speak later on, except this infinitesimal, I have been very, very careful not to use speculations, even by the authors who have written beautiful articles on Newton. But the moment I saw some speculative tendencies, I have removed them. So I would like forgiveness. Here I was actually speculating that Newton may have used the word, may have combined the two words infinite and small, infinitesimal. But yes, of course, I'm willing to, I will definitely accept if I come to know that these words were used earlier than Newton also. Okay. So apologies if I thought Newton did it. It was a speculation. I accept that. Now, so just